Well, welcome to this month's show, Sparks. It's our monthly innovation program to exchange innovation ideas. And with me today is James Priest from Sociocracy 3.0. Now, James was at the tail end of the conversation we had last month with Chris Benujilik. We're both self-organizing companies choosing a very different form of governance to achieve greater agility and more flexibility and really engage people at a deeper level. So one of the reasons why James is on this program today is because his experience with conflict pointed to the fact that when companies and organizations and people get into a snit, get into difficulties and challenges, it's largely because they don't have the tools or the structure to really work together effectively and to make decisions effectively together. So today what we're going to do is talk about the tension that exists between typically more agile parts of your company. It might be an agile unit in your company, but it also might be the other side around it. That you might be agile and having a lot of frustration with management. So it's not restricted to that particular scenario, but I'm sure the insights you'll gain from the conversation we'll have today will inform that particular scenario. So James, I'd like to turn it over to you, and let's talk about. Start with talking about what sociocracy is and just give us a sense of how it's evolved, and then what's the practical application and why is it different than other things out there. So over to James.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks, Dawna. Before I jump into sociocracy, then, just to pick up on the topic you raised, this tension between management, product, sometimes customer service, the kind of corporate end, and then the agile teams. It seems that there's a kind of polarization, basically. One is very much built on command control, and for good reason, because we're dealing with increasing complexity. There's a need to navigate and to adapt to the changes that are happening, and a lot of vulnerability in organizations. So on the one side, you have this command control, micromanagement approach, and then on the other, you've got the agile teams who are super flat, super pluralistic, really pushing into the bounds of a totally different way of self-organizing together. And I think there's fors and against on both sides, actually. And one of the problems is there's not so much equivalence between the two sides. So they tend to be a bit polarized and disconnected. And I think the big question today is, one, how can we build bridges between the two sides so that we can improve the flow of information, and also to distribute power and decision-making on both sides of that, and to connect them together, and also to identify what are some of the core benefits of both of these approaches, to make sure that whatever improvements we make and whatever future iterations of governance and operations we implement, that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think there's a lot of value and a lot of arguments as to why people in management would wish to hold on to things, because they're really wanting to take care, and it's important to recognize. Usually there's a very genuine intention there, but also at the same time, people in agile teams see that there's so much benefit in distributing leadership and autonomy amongst teams. So how do we do that? How do we marry the two together? So perhaps that's something we could speak about today, and I could share a bit about why I'm excited with sociocracy.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just...
That's a wonderful question.
Yeah, so I'm just going to open up my screen here and just check that you can see this.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, okay, so we mentioned on the last program about Sociocracy 3.0. This will be a term that's new to many people, probably not the 3.0, but quite possibly the sociocracy. And I won't go into this in too much detail here. You can go to the Sociocracy 30 site. But basically, to just give the background, that sociocracy has been around for about 165 years as a concept. So it's gone through various iterations. And basically, sociocracy is about governance by the companions or by the friends. And a more, you could say it's like governance by the social group. And so this just tracks the history over these last 150 years or so. And you can see more recently, around 1970s, Gerard Endenberg with Endenberg Electrotechnique really began to polish within his company some of these principles and practices. And this evolved into the sociocratic method. And for some of the listeners, holacracy will be quite a common name on their ears. Brian Robertson took some of the core principles of sociocracy and then began to adapt them and synthesize them with other methodologies. And what we've done really is we dived into the tensions that we saw with the classic sociocracy approach, and also some of the tensions that we were seeing with holacracy too, particularly, for example, the need for this whole system implementation, and tried to extract the value from both, and see if we could discover what was lying beneath them both, where the common thread was. And this is really what 3.0 is about. So maybe I could move on a little bit. As you know, Dawna, we're a bit clunky with the presentation today because I had difficulty extracting the slides. So I'm just going to flip through these slides a little here.
Oh, we did that one, the tensions, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So just to give a very basic overview, a flyover of Sociocracy 3.0. In my background, working with groups and organizations, I see that there's a lot of tensions. And if you look behind tensions, you often see that they're informed by people's beliefs and values. And so what we realized some time ago now, before 3.0, was that there was a lot of merit in organizations identifying some key values which defined their kind of culture, yeah, and also set some limits, ethical parameters for action. So what you see here, this sphere of values represents organizational values. And it's quite interesting because what to one person leads to tension, to another person doesn't at all. And the reason for this is because of difference in values. So if you imagine an organization that gets clarity around its basic values, then people are aligned within that, then you start to experience tensions that are also informed by these values. And so Brian Robertson with Holacracy, I think, made a great observation. It's also known as the creative tension. He saw that there was this disparity between our observations of the current reality sometimes and the future that we imagine might be possible on the basis of our beliefs and values. And so what we did to begin with was to look into tension and see what was behind these tensions that would lead to us wanting to respond in some way.
Excellent, excellent. Then you can actually use it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a drawing here that just shows a kind of process, basically, that we discovered. So just to be clear, 3.0 wasn't anything that we created. It was more something that we found lying behind organizations that were focused towards vision or purpose. And just for the record, if you look at vision, vision is always motivated by some kind of anticipation of what the world would look like if we fulfilled some kind of needs. Yeah. So if we look at the current reality and we see something lacking, and then we consider, well, how can we create some kind of value to satisfy the lack? So I see somebody hungry. I might have 20 pounds in my pocket, but it's not going to serve them anything. I need to transform that 20 pounds into something that's going to serve them, i.e. food. So if you look at this diagram here, you see behind tension, we're invited to look at the current reality, to establish what's true and distinguish that from our evaluations and our assumptions. And then if we look within the current reality, we see that there are needs associated with it. And the tension comes about through certain needs that are important from our values that aren't being met. And so what we did was we said in 3.0 to just create a kind of umbrella name for this combination of current reality and needs. We would just call it a driver, because it's this disparity between current reality, anticipated future, and the needs that drives us into action. And so from that, we realized that the way organizations respond to drivers, because we're all responding to drivers, it's like this sentence that I'm saying now is a response to the current reality, that people don't have the information I have to share, and there's a need for understanding. So I'm driven to act in this case and speak. So if we look at how an organization would navigate according to tension, there's a number of ways in which they can resolve it. One is just through doing something. I'm hungry, eat. Another one would be through policy decisions. So creating some kind of agreement as to how we would go about creating value to satisfy needs. Another way might be to create a role, and holacracy is very big on this. It's that if there's a tension, create a role, give the accountability to someone and let them resolve it. And also another way we can do it is to create a group, a circle, as we would call it in 3.0. So this basically shows the process from tension to driver, and then the various ways that we would resolve it. And I'm just going to pause here, Dawna, just to check in, because this is very familiar content to me, but I want to see if it's making sense to you.
It does make sense to me, thank you. But I think what from a management point of view, if you look at this, you've got the intersection that you're going to have between, say, an agile team and management is what needs to be done, and that's the side of it. Who needs to be doing it, which is the role side of it, and then what are the higher level of governance guidelines, if you will, which shows up in the policy conversation. So management is really concerned, or going to be largely concerned, with policy, and are we taking the right action? So, I mean, if I just translate it, that's how I would see it. Does that make sense? Have I got that down?
Yes. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay,
and
good.
Maybe we can jump on a bit here. I just need to scan through and see if we can find the actual image here. Yeah. So this is a very simple perspective on the field of values that we spoke about. Yeah. And within that, you have the organization. So obviously the organization's business fits within their values. And within that, you would have circles or teams. So in the first instance with a startup, you would just have a pioneer circle, just a group of people who are interested about satisfying some need together. And they would do that in various ways, probably with defining some roles to begin with and making some agreements. So you can see roles and policies here. And at some point, as the initiative scales, then they might begin to create circles. So what we have in 3.0 is nested circles. You have domains of accountability within domains of accountability. We call this supersets and subset domains. And what defines a domain is a driver. Yeah, so whenever we identify a tension and we find that there's a reason to act, there's needs that we could meet which would serve our kind of overall driver of the organization, then we can come up with policies, roles, or circles to respond to it. And so if you apply that thinking, you have to kind of retrofit this model over the existing organizational structures, because what we have at the moment is a kind of hierarchical image rather than a nested circles image. But actually, if you can improve the flow of information between people who are affected by decisions, yeah, and give people a voice in those decisions, then you open the potential to tap collective intelligence throughout the organization, regardless of people's position within the hierarchy. So there's still a lot of scope for functional hierarchy. You can still have management offering guidance and so on, but what you really want to do is you want to tap the people who are invested around particular drivers in the decision making to resolve those issues. And this is where the whole effectiveness of the hierarchical model falls down, because there's this misperception between being in a management function, which is just a function. Yeah, it's kind of like to coordinate, to manage things, and having some kind of supremacy to make policy decisions, regardless of what other people say about them. So I think this is what we see expressed in the physical manifestation of some of these larger corporations, where on the one side you've got this human potential to be very flat and very pluralistic in the decision making, a bit too flat, I think, because actually it can become very ineffective and misaligned. And on the other side, people who are saying, no, it's really important to have a voice in the decisions, and so I'm going to make sure that my voice influences the decisions. So what we're saying in 3.0 and in Sociocracy and Holacracy is to give voice to people who are affected by these decisions. And there's a number of ways of doing that within classic Sociocracy, which is beyond the scope of this conversation today.
What I find interesting about, well, a couple of things. I'm just going to give some observation. Tell me if I'm understanding this accurately, because I'm hoping whatever I say will be relevant to our viewers. The values, that, in order to enter into Sociocracy, you have to gain clarity on the difference. Well, actually, for any company, even function today, you have to be very clear about what the difference is between your values and your beliefs, so that you can parse out the stuff that you believe to be true, which would be your beliefs, versus values which transcend and are much more deeply embedded in everything. Yeah. Is that fair?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so, if I got that right, the other thing I'm hearing you say is that you can actually marry. You can take the Sociocracy form of governance, which gives some structure. It provides stability, which is in fact what hierarchies originally intended to do. But it provides stability through a different process whereby people can contribute to decision making, own it, and become more invested in the success of the organization. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And it's important to just clarify to the listeners, when you talk about giving people a voice in the decisions that affect them, people immediately start to think consensus. And consensus decision making can be fine, and particularly in groups, a single issue group with a high level of trust, it can be a wonderful way of really distilling to get to that kind of proposal that you really all feel aligned with. But when you're dealing with complexity, multiple decisions needing to be made on a regular basis, then you can't really afford consensus because there's just not the time to be able to do it. And so I think what's kind of interesting to note about sociocracy, and let's just see if we can find the picture here, because I know we were looking at it earlier. So we evolve policies, we make decisions in order to resolve tensions and serve needs. But what we say in the decision-making process in sociocracy is to look for good enough for now and safe enough to try policies. So the question isn't so much, is this the best that we can do, but it's, is there any reason not to try this right now? And in the absence of reasons not to try it, then we implement it, test it, learn quickly from the feedback we get, and then evolve the policy. So this brings a lot of relaxation to people. It allows us to run very lightweight. It's kind of like user testing with in development. You know, we come up with a concept. We don't want to build the whole thing on the basis of our vision of what it should be like. We test it out and we get feedback on a regular basis, and then we adapt the development to reflect the needs of the user. So this Agile principle is applied exactly the same to policy decision making within sociocracy. And I think this is what really sets it aside. We're deliberately seeking objections. We're deliberately asking people to be accountable for speaking up if they see reasons why proposals bring harm. And in the absence of reasons why they bring harm, to run with it, test it, fail fast, learn from it, and apply learning to the future iterations.
That's excellent, because what it allows is, first of all, it means you don't have to be perfect, which in this world is a dangerous thing to do, because the minute you think you're perfect, you're complacent, and you're going to be hit from behind, because just the speed of change is so rapid that,
Sure.
that as soon as you enter into the idea that everything is perfect, in other words, you really have to shift from controlling everything to gaining greater confidence in your capacity to respond to what shows up. And I think that's a huge competency right now.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, it takes a little imagination to picture it, but really what we're doing in 3.0 is we're inviting the people to be the sensors. It's like the nerve endings of the system. And so there's clear routes for tension to travel always to the places where there's most accountability to address them. And then there's clear processes to validate those tensions, to check that really there's something occurring in the current reality that requires a response, identify the needs, and then we can target policy decisions, we can target our actions directly towards satisfying these needs. And as the current reality changes, as the needs are met, or we discover new needs, so we constantly adapt and change. So it's like really putting your eye on the ball. And one of my criticisms of purpose as a kind of overall guiding focus, or a vision as an overall guiding focus, is it's not the bottom line. If we look behind it, we find needs. And so the argument is to bring the attention to the needs themselves. And then one, because it helps us to really keep our eye on the ball and adapt where necessary. But secondly, if we've satisfied the needs, we don't have to carry on fulfilling a purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my own version of that would be purpose provides the long-term beacon. So you've got a sense of where you're going, but this approach really, brings you down to what do I have to make decisions on in the now? What's my immediate focus? So because of that balance, I think companies end up in a big mess. They lose sight of why they exist, and then just get into a spin cycle.
I think that's a great way of putting it. You could say that the policy is implicit. It's always, the purpose rather is implicit. It's always to satisfy needs. And vision's a nice idea. It's imagining what the world might look like if we satisfy those needs. But let's check regularly to see that what the world's actually starting to look like as we satisfy them. So we don't get fixated on vision and we keep our eye on the needs instead. Yeah,
a much more dynamic capacity for oversight in terms of how the company is governed.
Exactly.
Yeah, excellent.
So I think I'll jump out of the screen share.
Okay, great. Now, just quickly, we've got democracy, sociocracy, holacracy, we've got all kinds of ocracies out and about in the world today. And I think for any management decision maker or anybody trying to decide, startups looking at how are we going to organize ourselves? How are we going to make decisions together? Which I hope those are both questions they're asking. The next question is, what's the difference and how do I make that, how do I, are there principles that separate sociocracy from holacracy? Because it sounds the same in certain ways. There's tensions involved in both processes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of similarities. How would you advise someone to sort out when sociocracy is the right approach for you versus when you're looking at something like holacracy?
Okay, well, just to be clear first, I'm just going to give my uninformed opinion about that. I haven't trained in holacracy. I have trained extensively in sociocracy, so I can speak more clearly to that. But in my amateur observation of the two, and speaking with many people who've crossed both sides, it seems to me that holacracy, one argument that I think stands for that Brian Robertson made was the fact that if we focus on purpose, then we can really discover the organization that wants to emerge. Yeah, so he's really tried to clear the space for people to be open enough to allow whatever emergence is occurring to do so. And also about holacracy is Brian took the governance process of sociocracy, adapted it, and then built in processes for handling operations as well. So it's a kind of whole system implementation. You can just upload it, sign the constitution, and train the people and run with it. Yeah, I think that has a lot of appeal to certain organizations. There's also a lot of resistance from other organizations because they find it restrictive and constraining. Is quite limiting, basically. And so more kind of flat, pluralistic, anarchistic people are really kicking against that. They don't want to put themselves in that box. Sociocracy, on the other hand, just focuses on governance. Yeah, it gives you a very clear form that you can follow to discover and agree how you would organize your operations, your workflow, but it doesn't give you any prerequisites or imperatives as to how to do it. And it's vision focused, so it's really inviting you to dream, to imagine the future you want to see, and then to orientate towards that. So there's fors and against for both sides, I think. Personally, from now on, I think I'm going to be teaching 3.0. And the reason is because I think it's integrated the value from both sides. What it doesn't offer is a whole system imperative. You could upload all of 3.0, which is mainly sociocracy anyway, with this added element of focus on values and needs. But you can also take it a modular approach. And this is one of the things that we wanted to do, was to free people up to experiment. And to be fair, you can do the same with sociocracy. You can take pieces and test it out. And there's a big recommendation: don't try and implement the whole thing at once. Test it, start small, get feedback from small user groups, share the feedback with the organization, and slowly introduce this culture, including the culture of consent. And I think this approach makes a lot of sense, because what we're doing with all of these systems actually isn't just looking at transforming the organization and its culture. What we're really doing is looking at a transformation of perspective of the human beings who are involved in the organization.
Right.
Because it's quite radical to shift to this solutions focus. It's quite radical to realize, actually, now what I'm invited to do is speak up every time I see a problem. Speak up every time I feel a tension. We've been trained to keep quiet, unless we're in a position of rank to speak out. So this in itself is quite a radical shift. And so I think these changes are going to take some time, and we see some people really emerging with this perspective now, and a lot of other people are still much more traditional in their worldview, with a lot of vulnerabilities around change and doing things differently, facing a lot of concerns and vulnerabilities around fear of lack and less productivity and so on. So there's this tension, because we need action, we need to shift and change. We see it more and more, and yet the kind of unconscious response from people is to become more rigid, revert back more and more to the thinking that led to the problems to start with. And so that requires some kind of delicacy and a broad perspective, long game implementation.
That makes enormous sense, because what you're really asking people to do is to move from a place of passivity, waiting for instructions, keep your voice, suppress your voice because it's not good to put it out there. They're moving from, basically, it's a 180 shift. You're moving from that over to express your voice, a place of trust, and yeah, it is going to be different for everybody. It's going to be, and there's going to be units that are going to catch on and go because it's their more natural and intuitive way of operating. but they're going to be out of sync with other parts of the organization that are going to take a little longer to see, feel confident that this is a way that they can step into while feeling safe on just about every.
Yeah, exactly. And from a senior management point of view, it's like them understanding that the babies they're looking after, the vulnerabilities that they're taking care of and they're so used to doing, including themselves, and their own stability and well-being, can be taken care of in different ways. So it's not because if we just run with a consensus kind of flat paradigm with no clear structure, no clear form, then we're going to run into big problems because that can't handle complexity either. So the more pluralistic egalitarian folk who are kicking against those old structures and kicking against structure full stop do well to recognize there are structures that can be safe and do serve us as human beings. And at the same time is on the other side of it, the other side of the coin, the more corporate bodies and the senior management who are really hanging onto the ship and thinking without me the whole thing goes down, can also open their eyes and see that there are some structures that preserve the drivers they're taking care of, but can do it in far more effective and resilient ways. When people start to realize this, I think we'll start to see some big shifts.
I agree, because it's the halfway point between the pendulum swing of over control to none, or at least the perception that there's very little control, to that place of what do we need to be controlling and how do we need to be controlling it, and then where do we just let people do what they do best and give it away. So yeah, very, very well put. So thank you, James. Where do people go for more information on what you're doing in your work?
Well, you can follow the sociocracy30.org website. It's just up. I should mention my dear friend and colleague Bernard Bockelbrink in Berlin. We've been developing 3.0 in our own time. So it's been a lot of work the last months and a lot of tension. We've processed a lot of tension between us.
Putting it into practice.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we discovered that the process of discovering 3.0 was the thing that helped us to understand what 3.0 was. Really amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah, check out the website there. We've got the presentation up now. We'll be adding audio to that in the next couple of weeks. You'll probably see some changes to text because we're still fine-tuning. We're practicing what we preach. We're learning from the feedback we get and adapting. And there's a big invitation to participate. And over the coming months, we hope to be releasing much more material.
Excellent. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Dawna. Pleasure.